In the fall of 2013, we ventured to central and north central Italy. We traveled in the fall of that year as we like to travel on the shoulder seasons. There's usually less people, the weather is milder, school is in session. It really is the way to go if you can. You fly into Rome, of course. As this was our first visit, we spent 3 days walking the historic center, stopping at most of the iconic spots. The Colosseum, the Roman Forum, Palatine Hill, Pantheon, and the Vatican. But we also spent some time just walking around. I don't have to convince you that Rome is historic to the nth degree, but there really is no way you can see everything in a couple days, so why try? There are lots of churches and cathedrals that do tend to blend together after a certain amount of time. We certainly saw our share of Jesus babies. You really can't understand Rome without looking at the Roman Empire, which was from about 500 BC to 500 AD. John Romer, one of my favorite historians, came up with what strikes me as a very plausible theory about the Roman Empire, specifically about the fall of the Roman Empire. Now, John Romer is a British historian and archaeologist. He's actually best known for his work as an Egyptologist. You look him up. He's actually done some very significant work in that area. But John Romer is also known for his knowledge of the Roman and Byzantine empires. And he had this to say about the term that we've all heard, again, the fall of the Roman Empire. Now I'm going to paraphrase his ideas. John contends that the Roman Empire didn't fall so much as it changed and moved east. He points out that the last Roman emperor of the West moved the crown from Rome east to Constantinople, which is now Istanbul in Turkey. This was around 500 AD when the Byzantine Empire was just really getting started on its ascent. Now, when the crown moves to a different city, so does the government, the generals, the administrators, and even the architects and artists. All the people needed to make things work moved along with the crown, leaving Rome behind. As John states, Rome didn't fall at all. It just got poor. He makes the case that the story of the fall of the Roman Empire was instigated by the popes during the Renaissance of the 1400s to finally, and quite successfully I might add, finally lay to rest the old pagan empire and proclaim the rise of the new Christian empire in Rome to the west. The popes pulled out all the stops to use their propaganda in the likes of Michelangelo and Raphael to advance their Christian stories through their art. Because remember, there were very few books at the beginning of the Renaissance. The printing press was just being developed. Art was the literature of the day. And besides, he contends, Rome was modeled off of the old cities of the East, such as Athens, Antioch, and Alexandria. So as John says, Rome didn't fall at all. It merely came home. In my opinion, the Colosseum is one of those places that you visit once. Now, it is definitely impressive and worth a visit. And maybe I found it too controlled or maybe too confined. That's understandable with the vast amount of people crawling all over it. It reminds me of SeaWorld in San Diego. When I lived there in the 80s, visiting friends and families always wanted to go there. I hated it. It was always hot, crowded, and full of worn-out parents and kids who were stressed out and grumpy. I cringe thinking of it now. I would bet that the citizens of Rome feel much the same way about the Colosseum. These are the famous Spanish Steps. They were built in the 1800s to connect the Spanish embassy at the top and this church, whose name I cannot pronounce, with the Holy See, the heart of the Catholic Church, at the bottom. The unique design and really its elegance has made it a popular place for painters, poets, and anyone who is attracted to this place for inspiration. And in fact, Doug and I found just that almost every evening we were in Rome. Because after all, it is the thing to do, when in Rome. I am hearing of the government placing a ban on people lounging on the steps. I guess I can maybe understand their attempts to end the eating and drinking in the area. But the fact remains that there really is no better place to just watch the world go by. Needless to say, the people of Rome are heatedly divided over the matter, with critics describing it as overreaching and even fascist. The Pantheon. Now that building has captured my attention. John Oschendorf, a professor of engineering and architecture at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, has this to say about the Pantheon, and I quote, "By every measure of success of a building, from an architectural, from an artistic, and from an engineering standpoint, I would argue that the Pantheon is the greatest that was ever built. There's no greater definition of success for a building than it's been standing for 20 centuries." Frankly, I agree. Doing the research for this video has been a trigger for me to reconsider and renew my interest in this building. Its date of construction is uncertain, although scholars think it was probably dedicated in 126 AD. After 2,000 years, the Pantheon's dome is still the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome. Now think about that. There may be others, but find me another record of anything that has held for 2,000 years. A lot has been discussed regarding how the dome was constructed, and much about this building's historic and technical status remains in debate or simply unexplained. And although there is little that is undisputed about the construction of this building, it is agreed pretty much by all that the dome was built using this single casting of concrete in layers. The layers were successively lightened by mixing lighter and less dense aggregates as construction progressed up and in. With that said, a perfect circle could fit in this building. Its height to the oculus and the diameter of the interior circle are the same, 142 feet. The interior of the dome features an incredible coffered ceiling. The 140 coffers were made by pouring concrete onto large wooden formwood blocks. As well as being aesthetic, they had a fundamental role in reducing the weight and accelerating the setting of the concrete. The oculus also helps lighten the load and is more and more appreciated for its sundial effect. On April 21st, which is the anniversary of the founding of Rome, the light from the oculus shines directly on the main entrance. The beam of light almost exactly matches the semicircular stone arch set above the doorway. Emperors would use this for an effective grand entrance for the always welcomed chance to reinforce and proclaim their status. By simple observation, you see most visitors look up and around when inside. While not to be discounted, I found myself also focusing down to the floor. The dramatic circle and square relationship of this floor underlies the basic geometry of the building. The floor you see today retains the exact pattern and color schemes as from the past, but the materials are not all original. Reoccurrent floods from the nearby Tiber River causing much of the damage. Extensive restoration work was performed on the floor in 1873. Approximately 2/3 of the floor was replaced, resurfaced, and relaid at that time. The Pantheon is one of the most imitated buildings in history. This building has been enormously influential in Western architecture from at least the Renaissance on, starting with Brunelleschi's dome of the Santa Maria del Fiore in Florence, which we visited on this trip and will discuss shortly. The U.S. Capitol, the Jefferson Memorial, the Killian Court Dome at MIT, and the University of Virginia Rotunda all owe inspiration for their domes from the Pantheon. Frank Lloyd Wright used the Pantheon as the prototype for the Guggenheim Museum in New York. I have to say that of all the sites in Rome we visited, the Vatican receives my least enthusiasm. But the Vatican and its museums are there, need to be seen, and away we went. The most imposing building in the Vatican is, of course, St. Peter's Basilica. Built during the 4th century and rebuilt during the 16th century, it's erected over the tomb of St. Peter the Apostle. It is the second largest religious building in Christendom. Somebody on the Ivory Coast just had to build an even larger basilica. The interior of the Vatican is imposing, ornate, lavish, elaborate, and even somewhat overbearing. If you look beyond the obvious religious servitude, someone wants to impress. The wealth, the abundance, the detail, the subtle nuances to power, and not so subtle statements of God. And the brand names, Michelangelo, Raphael, Caravaggio, Bernini, and the countless painters, sculptors, metalworkers, ceramic artists, and architects, all masters of their calling for virtually all known skills, crafts, and trades of that time. Many of them, now nameless, contributed to this sumptuous enterprise. Well, they succeeded. I'm impressed. Too much, really. I don't know how anyone could browse through the Vatican without, at some point, think how much poverty could be alleviated or suffering erased by selling some of this stuff. But that's a discussion for a different time. The Vatican museums are truly enormous. With 54 galleries and over 70,000 works of art, it is one of the largest collections in the world. Some of the world's most important masterpieces are on display there, all of which have been collected by a series of popes through the ages. This completely over-the-top collection draws over 6 million visitors each year. I'm assuming that's pre-COVID. The Vatican museums can trace their origin to one marble sculpture discovered, or rediscovered to be more precise, in the 16th century. Laocoon and his sons was discovered on January 14, 1506. After being lost to history, it was unexpectedly unearthed in a vineyard near the walls of the old city of Rome. The then Pope Julius II sent Michelangelo and Giuliano da San Gallo, who was an architect. They were working at the Vatican at the time. He sent them to help dig it up, examine the discovery, and report back promptly. On their recommendation, the Pope immediately purchased the sculpture from the owner and placed it on public display. It is stunning, but also a little disturbing. The Raphael rooms. These 4 rooms are a part of the apartment of Pope Julius II. You see, Pope Julius was a big fan of many of the artists of the time. He's the one who commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel. Most people don't know this, but Michelangelo did not want to do it. His passion was sculpting, but you just don't say no to the Pope. Hence, the Sistine Chapel. After seeing the work of the 25-year-old Renaissance artist Raphael, the Pope commissioned him to paint his apartment. Raphael began working on these paintings in 1508, but was frequently distracted by his work in St. Peter's Basilica. He died in 1520 with his work completed by his assistants. Raphael asked to be interred in the Pantheon, where he remains to this day. The Apollo Belvedere by Leocaires is a celebrated marble sculpture from classic antiquity, and probably this is his most famous work. The Greek god Apollo is depicted as a standing archer having just shot an arrow. Although there is no agreement as to the precise narrative being depicted, the conventional view has been that he has just slain the serpent Python. But I have a hard time getting over the amount of riches enjoyed by an entity that consistently solicits more and more money. There, I said it. But on a higher note, the Vatican museums and the Pantheon also highlight a recently discovered passion of mine: porphyry, imperial porphyry. Well, what is it? Porphyry is a stone. Most people would call it a granite. You might recognize its deep purple color. The very best of this stone would come to be known as imperial porphyry. Then, as now, purple being the color of royalty. Imperial porphyry became symbolic with imperial power. Tiberius, the second Roman emperor, decreed that imperial porphyry would be for the exclusive use of the imperial family. Before I even knew what defined porphyry, I found myself drawn to this stone. After returning home, finally recognizing my interest and doing some research, I found that I had taken photos of many of the significant pieces found in Rome. Let's start with the Pantheon. It has porphyry, and had porphyry, as it was often appropriated and reused for sites throughout the area. But here's what's left. This is the sarcophagus of Umberto I, King of Italy. The highly polished surface and inviting smoothness speaks of a newly unified Italian government seizing at least partial control of the Pantheon's interior from the Vatican. Napoleon Bonaparte wanted to be buried in a tomb of imperial porphyry. He organized search parties to locate the imperial quarry, but was unable to find the one source in Egypt. Its location had been lost in the Middle Ages when the Roman Empire was shrinking and had lost control of the area. Alas, he was buried in a sarcophagus of much more common red quartzite, which I bet he wanted everyone to think was porphyry. As a final insult, the ancient Egyptian quarry was rediscovered just 2 short years after Napoleon's passing. In the Pantheon, porphyry can also be found in what is called the attic. The attic level is the area between the bottom columns and pilasters and the dome. Not surprising, the Pantheon has gone through numerous redecorations in its lifetime to include the attic area. Part, but only the part I've indicated was restored in 1930, which included replacing porphyry where originally located. Perhaps the most visually dramatic use of porphyry in the Pantheon is on the floor. Remember, about 2/3 of the floor was replaced, resurfaced, and relaid in 1873. That rework did include porphyry in its design, such as this large circle in the center. This impressive slab would have been noted by sophisticated Romans who would well know its significance. This is the Emperor Nero's porphyry bathtub in the Vatican museums. At 25 foot in diameter, Nero's bath is impressive as a creation of decadence that defined the years he ruled. Porphyry was highly prized at the time for several reasons. The first being the color. It undeniably states royalty. It was also extremely hard, able to be shaped only by the high-quality steel produced by the Romans. Another reason was its rarity. There was only one quarry in Egypt where imperial porphyry could be found, making it fantastically expensive. That was the quarry for which Napoleon sent out the search parties. This is the sarcophagus of Saint Helena, also in the Vatican. Saint Helena was the mother of the Emperor Constantine the Great. The museum has two enormous porphyry sarcophagi. It's interesting that both tombs have no Christian imagery, just the most Roman of Roman decorations, horsemen leading vanquished prisoners. Imperial porphyry is arguably the most historically important stone in the world. Living with imperial porphyry meant that you possessed the means to control it, and that, in itself, was further proof of your royal blood. Its rarity and exclusive ownership by the imperial family meant that in its day, this stone was more valuable than gold. Even today, historians estimate the value of Nero's bathtub at around $2 billion. If you do a little research on the internet today, you might find a 2-inch by 2-inch porphyry tile for the price of $440. We next traveled north along the Mediterranean coast to the Cinque Terre. The Cinque Terre. The direct translation of Cinque Terre is 5 lands. 5 cliff-hugging towns overlooking the Mediterranean just south of Genoa. We stayed 3 days in Rio Maggiore, the southernmost of the 5 towns. To get anywhere, you were either going uphill or downhill. But I have to say, there is something about towering rocky cliffs overlooking a blue sea. We found a great place for a bottle of wine at sunset. I think we made it there every evening. There are trails that go up, over, and down between each town. We started at the northernmost town, heading south, to cross up and over to Vernazza, then Corniglia, then Manarola. And of course, making friends wherever we went. Here's a good overview of Rio Maggiore. You see the train track, which is about the only route into town. The tracks head into the tunnels between each town for a train ride that only sees the light of day at each town's station. In fact, you can't even get a car into Rio Maggiore without some very special permits. It was probably a wise decision. Note the rocky point to the left overlooking the water. That's the location of the next video clip. The second day there, fishermen started pulling all boats out of the water, water taxis were canceled, and the storm rolled in at first dark. We walked to the high point I just mentioned to watch an angry sea take its vengeance against the coast. As you will soon hear, the winds were howling and we were absolutely covered in salt spray by the time we left. At that rocky overlook, there was one floodlight shining down on the angry waters, which provided the only light for filming, but film I did. Somewhere in the roar, you may hear me exclaim perhaps the most profound and concise summation of an experience I have made to this day. Rio Maggiore, in all its glory. Rio Maggiore, in all its glory. And glorious it was. Here's the scene at the same spot the next morning. We were wearing every layer of clothing we brought with us that dark and stormy night, and were absolutely exhilarated by the sheer power of an infuriated ocean. And I remember thinking the storm was going to mess up our vacation. If Florence, Italy is not everyone's favorite city, it should be. After all, it's the home of Michelangelo, of Leonardo, the Renaissance. It's definitely smaller and less active than Rome. It's more relaxed, there are fewer cars, less hustle and bustle. It's very walkable. This is the Duomo. It was built with the largest dome at that time. They're still trying to figure out just how exactly did Brunelleschi do this without constructing any supports beneath. It's actually two domes. The outer dome is made of brick and mortar in a herringbone pattern, which was the key. It's if you get a chance to look into it, you really should. It's quite ingenious how this herringbone pattern provided so much more support. Although maybe less ostentatious, Florence is absolutely permeated with art and culture. You feel it as you walk the streets. After all, it's the home of David. And although much less famous, it's also the home of my favorite sculpture from Michelangelo. This Pieta sits in an unassuming museum behind the Duomo. You can't get close to any Michelangelo sculpture. They keep you away from them. David is way up out of reach. The Pieta in the Vatican is way behind a plexiglass barrier, for the love of God. But this statue didn't have an hour-long, shoulder-to-shoulder wait to see. You can walk right up to it. Touch it if you could, but you won't. Michelangelo started carving this one late in his life. You see, it's not complete. The arms and part of Jesus' face are polished and supple, while Mary is just starting to take shape. but it also reveals the process Michelangelo followed to carve these things. You can see the progress. It clearly illustrates more than just find a piece of marble and remove everything that doesn't look like Jesus. In the museums, we see the finished pieces. We don't see anything of the process, i.e., someone with a chisel and hammer pounding away on one of these things. Flaws in the marble revealed themselves too late in the process, and Michelangelo never finished it, as you can see. It is said that Michelangelo himself broke off the right arm of Jesus in a fit of desperation. You can see where it was reattached. We hit the jackpot with hotel rooms in Florence. The location was phenomenal. Second story, center window overlooking the Plaza della Repubblica, one of Florence's big downtown plazas. With a glass of vodka in hand, we spent a good portion of every evening on that small balcony, overlooking the plaza, just watching Italy. Tourists taking photos of the plaza and, well, us. If you looked hard enough, you would find us waving in numerous photos scattered across the globe. I had the brilliant idea of taking the sheet off the bed, stealing a white napkin from the cafe below, and slowly stepping out on the balcony, waving as the Pope. Although amused, Doug was not fancy to the idea. Nancy would have done it with me. And I still wonder, would I have been cheered or booed? On the way back to Rome, we stopped at Orvieto. Orvieto is one of what they call the hill towns north of Rome. These towns sit upon big, defensible plateaus that were formed from extinct and eroded volcanic cores. It's no secret that Rome and Florence grabbed onto the influences provided by the Renaissance. You readily see this in their buildings and their churches and their art. Orvieto, however, retained its medieval influences. This town, high up on the plateau, has the characteristics of appearing almost suspended above the valley below. A good little trick if you're trying to defend yourself from marauding invaders. And I imagine this isolation has helped maintain its medieval integrity. St. Patrick's Well. It was built to ensure Orvieto had a steady supply of water during a time of siege. This 175-foot deep well impresses engineers to this day. Digging this was a huge project. Even today, when faced with a difficult task, you may hear an Italian say, "It's like digging St. Patrick's Well." There are a lot of frescoes in Italy. Enough said. But perhaps the most provocative are a tantalizing series of Luca Signorelli frescoes in Orvieto's cathedral. These frescoes, painted in the 1500s, were created for a side chapel of the cathedral. These are not my photos, as I did respect their no photography directions. But check these out. It's a series of frescoes that begins with the creation and ends with the Last Judgment. Never have I seen a more moving series of paintings that so effectively builds to the most terrifying apocalyptic conclusion. As you might guess, my favorite is titled "The Damned Cast into Hell." The heathens of the world are tortured by demons. You can feel their suffering. The expressions of fear, always a good motivator, used quite effectively throughout history, including the present. The anguish, eternal damnation awaits. And then the moment of decision. Are you the damned, or are you the good people of the earth rising to the heavens, forever saved? You feel exposed just like these people, right in front of you. But I'm surrounded by the magnificence, by the awe. It literally takes my breath away. And this, my friends, is why I travel. So on to Rome for a day or two before wheels up to see a few sights and start the decompression process. Hanging out on the Spanish Steps one more time, watching the vendors with their eye-catching doodads, catching fragments of conversations in so many languages and dialects, trying to figure out an origin, or just watching them go by. Not a bad way to end the trip.